I would like to welcome everyone to the second half of day 2 of SURF's 2020 online conference, Supporting Rural Recovery and Resilience. Welcome if you're joining us for the first time, and welcome back if you participated in the session, the outstanding session earlier today. My name is Sean Markey. I'll be facilitating the session, and I was really looking forward to this when it was proposed as part of the online conference for this year. The topic of the session is Innovating through Infrastructure. And I think many of us, if not all of us in some capacity or another, have been working on and dealing with the rural infrastructure deficit and questions of rural infrastructure and service delivery for years. And of course, the COVID crisis put all of that under a microscope, not only in terms of the ability of communities to deal with the crisis, but as we heard from the minister and from many announcements over the past 6 months, infrastructure is a central tenet and pillar of recovery and resilience planning and investments going forward. So we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from our amazing panel on a variety of those different infrastructure dimensions. I'd like to introduce our amazing panel. Ashleigh Weeden is a PhD candidate at the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph. Welcome, Ashleigh, and you've been very much all over the coordinating and organizing this entire conference, so wonderful to see you here as a presenter as well. Wayne Kelly is the project coordinator for the Rural Policy Learning Commons and a PhD candidate with the School of Political Science and Sociology at the National University of Ireland. Dr. Deatra Walsh is the Director of Advocacy and Communications for Municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador. Welcome, Deatra. And Amy Hudson is a PhD candidate with Memorial University and the Director of Research and Education and Culture with Nunavut. And rounding out our third presentation group, Jay Maloney is a master's candidate in the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University, where I'm also located. Welcome, Jay. And Dr. Paul Kraehling is a postdoctoral researcher and sessional instructor with the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph. So an amazing panel of people and researchers and topics. So with that, I will turn it over, and we'll go in that same order. We'll turn it over to Ashleigh and Wayne for their first presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sean. And thank you as well to you for pulling quadruple, triple, quintuple duty throughout the last couple of days as well. So thank you to everybody for joining us here. All right. So as Sean said, Wayne and I are going to tackle a topic that's come up a ton over the last couple of days and certainly has come up over and over again in the last 7 months as we've all been sort of reckoning with what COVID means for our work and our lives. And before that, for many of us, for several decades, as we've wrestled with the massive gap between rural and urban communities in terms of their connection to critical broadband infrastructure, as well as within communities. It's not just a rural-urban problem, and I think we'll talk a little bit about this throughout the session. This is certainly a matter of equity across a broad number of socioeconomic factors and communities that have been made marginal through poor policy decisions. And I think right now what we're seeing is not new issues, but making the issues so severe that we certainly can't afford to ignore them any longer. And over the last even 24 hours, as I was saying, we've seen a number of announcements regarding funding, regarding programs, and I think what we're seeing is sort of a bit of a scramble to try to address some of these issues that have long gone unaddressed. So our contact information is there, so if anybody wants to scribble that down really quickly, I won't waste too much time going through both of those because Sean gave a delightful introduction of both of us. The digital divide is not just a divide anymore, it's becoming a chasm, right? It's becoming something that is so deep and so pervasive that it's almost it's daunting to think about how we're going to actually cross this divide. And I think that something that we've said in our position paper through the Rural Insight series, and something that we've been saying quite frequently, both in private discussions with Wayne and myself and with others, is that I think that sometimes this is talked about as if it's inevitable. We talk about any of these infrastructure gaps as if they're just a byproduct of rurality, when in fact they're a policy failure. This is the cumulative effect of bad public policy making, poor political leadership, and a lack of administrative follow through when it comes to actually evaluating programs as they're developed over time. For point of reference, this latest policy announcement is, I think, the 9th or 10th in the last 20 years of federal broadband investment initiatives. and we've never actually evaluated the 8 that came before the last in the last 2 years. So what is sort of threatening to happen now is something that I know Sean talked about yesterday and talked about in some of the seminal Rural Insight papers, is that we are at risk of throwing good money after bad if we don't do these kinds of policy investments along an evidence-based or informed way and move from shovel-ready to shovel-worthy. And even though we're delighted to hear Minister Monsef and the government make comments that recognize the unique challenges of rurality, who are touching on issues related to place-specific and capacity development in terms of those investments and using the right language, I remain concerned that the words and the actions aren't lining up. And maybe put it to Wayne on that front in terms of this is more than just an infrastructure policy decision as well. And I think that when we talk about this as if it's just going to be solved by putting glass in the ground or fiber, as it were, we miss a whole range of strategies that are needed to build digital capacity and digital readiness in our communities.
Yeah, so, and that's an important consideration here, is it's actually a dual divide. It's a capacity divide and a connectivity divide, and the connectivity divide gets all of the attention and all of the focus, but both of those need to be addressed. Connecting people to the internet is just the first step in sort of about a 4-step process. You got to get connected, you got to build the capacity, you got to build the culture of use, sort of help people understand what they can do with the technology. And then once you've sort of gone through all 3 of those phases, then you start to actually reap the benefits of digital technology and connectivity. Right now, we keep tripping over that first topic in connectivity. And as Ashleigh said, we haven't gotten it right yet. This digital divide has persisted for almost 30 years. I mean, it was first written about in the late 90s. The Canadian federal government came up with their first strategy in 2001. And they clearly recognized in that national broadband strategy that the divide was a huge challenge for rural communities and others related to whether it's income or education, and that it needed to be addressed for rural Canada to achieve its potential. And that was almost 20 years ago now.
And so we know that the number of issues that have come up in the throne speech, and certainly that we heard from Minister Monsef yesterday morning, and that we've heard in this latest announcement around the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the infrastructure investments that amount to about 10 billion total across a variety of portfolios, that broadband helps us address all 4 of the critical foundations in that throne speech. And I don't think it's an overreach on Wayne and my part to say this, that, you know, fighting the pandemic and saving lives, well, what better to help make sure that people can learn and work from home than having adequate infrastructure and the ability and the capacity to use it. You know, building back better is a big line in terms of the latest infrastructure announcements in terms of providing good jobs and allowing for participation in the modern economy. I know Wayne and I talked a lot about how the reference to the shift to a digital economy came on faster as a result of COVID than a lot of people were anticipating, but this isn't a thing we didn't see coming. So I find that a little bit tough to wrestle with in terms of having that be something that I necessarily buy. And I apologize if I'm coming across a little bit harsh or critical, but I think that what we're seeing right now in response to the emergency situations of COVID are a bit of a scramble in terms to recognize and respond to issues that have been going on for now more than a generation. And Canada at one time was a leader in building broadband infrastructure and in making sure that it was accessible and also being adopted and used. So making sure that not only is it available, but people are actually picking it up and using it. And over the last 20 to 30 years, we've really slid behind. I think we're actually at the very bottom of the OECD's list in terms of rural uptake of broadband technologies. And this is something that we can't afford to sort of gloss over with inadequate funding around sort of poorly framed programs. So I'll turn it over to Wayne to talk about the consequences of tripping over that first point when it comes to the throne speech. And we talk about how it's very easy for us to sit here and say, broadband addresses all these points, but what happens if we're not building the capacity to make good decisions about that?
Yeah, so again, the capacity side of this equation, you know, it's too often we think it's a build it and they will come sort of field of dreams approach. And so it's not just about getting things in the ground. You know, right back from when I got started involved in rural broadband, I remember going around as part of the community access site programs in Manitoba, providing some support, going to northern Manitoba, and I was there to install and help build some capacity around using these access centers. And I came across one center and the computers were in the box still, and they'd been in the box for 6 months. So a great policy got the infrastructure to a northern community, but nobody in that community at that time knew how to set up that computer and get it connected. And so that's just an illustration. And there's similar, you have to remember the technology has been evolving rapidly. So whether it's setting up a desktop, you know, 19, 20 years ago, or figuring out the latest iOS update to your phone, those are ongoing capacity challenges that need to be addressed. There's also a capacity element, and we've talked about that, and we heard Minister Monsef talk about it as well. There's a capacity element at the rural community levels in terms of actually being able to address, understand, and proceed with large digital infrastructure or capacity investments. It's really daunting at a rural community level if, you know, you're giving these several different offers to roll out high-speed internet to your community, if you can't distinguish between which one's positive or negative for your community, or what sort of the pros and cons might be. And it's even more daunting if you have policymakers, leaders, and people around the table that are making that decision that are still struggling to use their iPhones or to, you know, to use digital technology on a regular basis.
And so, you know, part of this is recognizing that infrastructure isn't neutral. I think sometimes we approach investments in any type of infrastructure, whether it's broadband, roads, waterways, any of these kinds of things, as if they're a physical asset separate from our social, economic, and political decision-making agendas. And so part of the framing around how we've identified the key issues that are in that Rural Insight paper is that we talk about how this is a policy failure that's produced inadequate infrastructure and challenged capacity, and that all of these things amount to an equity issue. And that equity issue spans across all of the sort of categories we tend to think of in terms of communities that have been made marginal through poor policy decision-making categories. But they also require a different way of looking at this infrastructure to respond to exactly what Wayne was talking about. We need to actually look at these things as a public good. So part of the key aspects of the recommendations and responses that we came up with, and things that we've been thinking about over the last day since hearing Minister Monsef speak and hearing everyone else in all of their sessions. I think it came up in the employment session, it came up in immigration, it came up in every aspect of the resilience piece, is that we often just say, we'll just build the broadband, we just need broadband, but very little is done in terms of figuring out the mechanics of how to govern this properly. And so we need to move to thinking about policy, fixing this policy failure through measures that address equity as a core principle of this foundation, and not just in access, but in terms of adoption. And then we also need to think about what this means to develop universal access and a place-based approach to development that doesn't defer to private interests first. Even in this announcement from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, it assumes that private capital is there and will come to the rescue. And every other broadband project we've had over the last 25 years has demonstrated that's categorically false. It will not happen. So I'm really worried about this idea of match $2 billion public dollars to private investment. And if we do, who retains control of that infrastructure? We haven't seen enough change in terms of the regulatory environment to actually invest appropriately in both the hard and soft infrastructure. And this has significant challenges for how we move forward. I'll turn it over to Wayne. I know that's a hard line to toe, but it's how I feel.
So, and I know we're right at time. And so just wanting to just sort of reiterate that, you know, what we're hearing from Minister Monsef yesterday is really encouraging. We're hearing there's new context that she's identifying around capacity and the unique situation for individual rural communities and regions. And that's fantastic because we haven't heard a lot about that in the past. So we're moving in the right direction. But as Ashleigh states, if we're still using the same policy approach that we've used for the last 20 to 25 years and it hasn't worked, what is going to be different? We really need to consider those alternative options for getting connectivity and capacity, digital connectivity and capacity into rural communities.
So that's our time. I highly encourage everyone, for more nitty-gritty on how we recommended going about these things, there's any number of strategies that we can do to create alternative futures when it comes to addressing the digital divide. The link to the to the Rural Insights paper is in the chat box there, but you can also find it through the conference website and going to SURF as well. So I'm just going to say, get in touch if you want to talk about this more. We love talking about it clearly, and we'd love to continue the conversation. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sean.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Wayne and Ashleigh. Really interesting presentation, bringing up some big themes for discussion: private versus public investment, big policy questions, but the need for place-based response and that tension between hard infrastructure and capacity. So really excellent overview of the issue. So thank you very much. So next we have Deatra Walsh and Amy Hudson, who will present on rural drinking water.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Sean. As Sean noted, my name is Deatra Walsh. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Communications at Municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador, and MNL, as we call it, is an organization representing 275 incorporated municipalities in our province. And I want to say thank you for joining us today in this important conversation on the challenges with rural drinking water infrastructure operations and maintenance in rural Newfoundland and Labrador during COVID-19, a very long title indeed. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Amy to just do a short introduction for herself as well.
Yes, hi, thanks for having us. My name is Amy, and I'm the Director of Research, Education and Culture with Nunatakavu Community Council. I'm also their co-lead negotiator on our RIRSD, or Recognition of Rights table, at our RIRSD table. The Nunatakavu Community Council is an Inuit governing organization that represents approximately 6,000 Inuit, most of whom still reside in Southeast and Central Labrador.
So as we begin the conversation, we want to talk a little bit and bring you into the drinking water realities in Newfoundland and Labrador. The communities across our province experience a wide range of realities, and access to safe, potable drinking water within the home is not uniform even today. In June of this year, 203 systems across the province were listed as being on a boil water advisory. And this was impacting 157 communities. And when I say communities, I mean that includes municipalities, but also local service districts as well. Some communities have multiple systems, and some have multiple boil water advisories. But think about this, 141 of those boil water advisories, impacting 103 communities, were considered long-term, meaning they had been in effect for more than 2 years, and many of these in excess of 10 years. So safe drinking water is an issue across our province. Potable water dispensing units, or PUDUs as we call them, have really come into play, and that's what we're going to talk about in our presentation in Newfoundland and Labrador as one solution to providing safe drinking water and to ensuring residents have access to safe drinking water. So a PUDU, and our understanding is that name and this particular kind of setup is quite unique to Newfoundland and Labrador, although similar things exist across the country. It's essentially a small-scale water treatment system, and it provides drinking water from water stored on site at a centralized location that's been treated using a combination of different water treatment processes. And water is manually collected by users or can be delivered to residents in water coolers. So currently, 32 communities have PUDUs in Newfoundland and Labrador.
And of the 32 communities with PUDUs, 10 of these communities are Indigenous communities who are represented governmentally or organizationally by 3 different Indigenous groups, Nunatakavu Community Council, Nunatsiavut Government, and Halibut First Nation. Black Tickle, on the southeast coast of Labrador, represented by Nunatakavu Community Council, is an island, remote island community off the coast Pictured here is their Poodoo station. And in this scenario, the Poodoo is the only source of clean drinking water or potable water in the community.
So early in the pandemic, MNL began a series of regional calls with our members. We quickly pivoted to Zoom, all of us, and we were very impressed at the municipal readiness for that. It surprised us, actually. And in those days, but it wasn't always easy, Ashleigh and Wayne, because not everyone had access. But in those days, when government messaging was firm and strong on hand washing, touch surface cleaning, and social distancing, and we were really relying, of course, all of us, on government-driven guidance. We still are, certainly. But leaders from our Poodoo communities had questions. They had questions about risks. What were the risks associated with their Poodoos? What did they need to do to ensure the safety of their Poodoo, but also the safety of the residents in their community? And how should they maintain their Poodoo during the pandemic because of their public accessibility? So MNL has had a strong relationship with government, with the provincial government during the pandemic, with respect to pandemic response and municipal guidance. We were very, very insistent that all guidance had to have a municipal lens to it, so that our members knew what they needed to do. And as an advocacy organization, that's our role. Our role is to get answers to the questions from our members. So we did bring these member questions and their concerns about Poodoos to the Department of Health and Community Services, and then the then Department of Municipal Affairs and Environment. And that prompted Poodoo pandemic guidance to be developed and distributed to our members. And you can see here just an example. I mean, we've all seen many examples of these variations of these signs. These were the ones that were produced for our members and issued by government for Poodoo guidance.
So of the 10 Indigenous communities in the province with Poodoos, 4 of those communities are within Nunatukawood in the southeast coast of Labrador. So as a representative governing organization, NCC quickly engaged a cross-section of people in our communities, well, territorially first, like businesses, elder and senior groups, various governance bodies, to identify emergent and immediate priorities and needs in the community as a result of the pandemic. And then NCC developed programming and services to respond to these needs during the pandemic, partnering with various levels of government and other stakeholders. Black Tickle, the photo you saw before, specifically required additional measures because its only source of drinking water is the Poodoo, and due to a system malfunction, or the system broke down during the pandemic, so bottled water, it was necessary to fly bottled water into the community and to have on hand. So we continue to do that throughout the pandemic, anticipating system breakdown, which is challenging, of course, in a remote island community sometimes to get the parts and equipment that you need to service the system.
Mm. And so one of the things we've realized in coming together for this report and doing the work that we're doing is not going to come as any surprise to anyone. It requires collaborative approaches. Addressing drinking water insecurity requires collaboration. So MNL has had a long-standing collaborative research relationship with scholars across its advocacy priorities, including drinking water. And our Poodoo-related member concerns, this prompted a discussion with researchers at Memorial University's Grenfell campus and the University of Guelph. And you may know these wonderful scholars, Drs. Kelly Weeden and Dr. Sarah Minnis. And we began a conversation with them on whether and what possibilities existed for further research and action. Of course, Kelly and Sarah did a large piece of work culminating in a report in 2014 on drinking water, and that report can be found on the MNL website, but it was about exploring solutions for sustainable rural drinking water systems.
And these discussions ultimately led to the development of a research project between the partners that you see here today, Doctors Kelly Weeden and Sarah Minnis, and Nunatsiavut Community Council, Nunatsiavut Government, and Halgo First Nation, and of course MNL. So our, the result of our early partnership on this really drove a community-based, place-based research project to identify and address water insecurity, and to work with communities to ensure that their poodoos and systems are operating well, but also to advocate for those communities as well. I'm waiting for the next slide.
Yes, and I'm trying to get there. I can't get there. Carry on. It's supposed to say key messages.
I wasn't sure if you were going to add anything. So some of the key messages, drinking water insecurity is a reality and a pressing issue, a challenging reality for communities throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. The pandemic, as with many other areas, exacerbates vulnerability, especially at the intersection of rural and remote places and infrastructure, like we just described throughout this discussion. This is especially true for drinking water and water for household use more generally. So our collaboration through the Poodoo in pandemic discussion and this research has been critical, informative, and really rooted in information sharing and advocacy.
And thanks so much for the opportunity to speak about this. It's certainly been an important experience and collaborative work for research and also for advocacy for drinking water security.
Wonderful. Thank you, Deatra. Thank you, Amy. Just a really interesting presentation. Some similar themes from earlier around these very long-term infrastructure challenges, but also providing some insights on the innovating side of this panel presentation title around collaboration, flexible responses, and of course the ongoing need for advocacy. So a few themes that are popping up. I've also been writing down some of the questions from the audience that we can get to when we're all through the presentations. And with that, I'd like to move on. Paul Kraehling and Jay Maloney are going to walk us through a presentation on green infrastructure.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Yes, so I'm presenting here very briefly today on this topic on behalf of the team that worked on this so Kasia Tolsma and Sean, yourself from the University of Simon Fraser, as well as Ashleigh, Weeden, and Ryan Gibson from the University of Guelph. So we're going to be quickly going through some work on that Jay and I have put together here in this presentation for you. So what we're looking at today is natural green infrastructure. There's lots of current terminology around words, and it can be buzzwords, but what we're looking at is the natural systems here. I've been looking at this topic for over 40 years, my adult lifespan. I was previously a municipal planner, a provincial planner, working on land use issues. And so I've always was frustrated through that experience that the environment was given short shrift in a lot of instances where it was an aftersight or it was something that got in the way of development. And so I went back to school and I got my PhD in 2018 from the Rural Planning, the Rural Studies program at the University of Guelph. And my dissertation topic was using green infrastructure as a tool to enable and enhance rural land use planning. So this topic for the discussion today is very close to my heart and interest. So Jay, next slide. So this is the frame of reference that I like to use in terms of defining sustainability, resilient communities. It's from Cato. So normally it's described as on the left side of the screen there, the graphic where sustainability is seen at the intersection of society, the economy, and the environment. But I like to look at it more so than on the right-hand side of the screen, where the environment is the basis on which society and the economy are structured. And Cato refers to this as either weak sustainability on the left side or strong sustainability as described on the right. So in looking at infrastructure, particularly across Canada, a third of Canada's infrastructure is in fair to poor condition. This is well documented by the FCM, and often in rural areas, again, it's worse. Our normal gray infrastructure, piped services, internet services, those kinds of things, as well as our social infrastructure in a lot of instances. Failures can cost 10 times more than preventative investments, so proactive intervention is much more worthy, but it is expensive. And I think this is where natural systems, natural infrastructure can assist in being quite a cost effective in looking at that kind of thing. Some of the failures we see are flooding, shoreline erosion, wildfires, a lot of those instances that are impacting rural places. If your infrastructure isn't up to stuff, then your economic development capabilities are also quite problematic. So again, that and the COVID-19 has added stress to all that, as we've all seen and heard. So what is green infrastructure? So green infrastructure, there are many different definitions on this, but what I'm putting forward here is that it represents the natural systems that are networks that can be engineered with human endeavor to deliver multiple ecological, social, and economic benefits. It's developed to address development challenges often found in urban areas, and this primarily gets focused around stormwater management because of the impervious nature. But rural communities also should look at this matter because they're richly blessed with a lot of open space, a lot of natural facilities and attributes that aren't necessarily harnessed. This illustration is from a little town just nearby Guelph, Rockwood, Ontario, which is richly endowed with natural infrastructure. So water, green facilities, all these elements together can assist in building a strong, resilient natural system to your community. So the slide here, a lot of words on the slide, but the intent is that it can operate in various elements, from those individual elements on the left-hand side of the screen, and then they can work with scalar from a local community level to a regional level to even a national or international level. So in terms of the work that we did with SURF, was that we looked at the functions and co-benefits that are derived from green infrastructure elements, source water protection, stormwater management, wastewater cleanup, that kind of thing, the social, recreational, tourism attributes, the potential for these elements to assist in climate change mitigation, adaptation, community health and well-being, livability, food security at the local level, and biodiversity enhancement. And these all have multifunctional benefits that go up and down the chain. And I've got some quite complex diagrams that can illustrate that. So the reasons to invest in nature now, green infrastructure provides multiple benefits that I've just quickly overviewed. It can improve environmental health, community health and well-being. It can be very effective in appreciating and value over time, as ecosystems that are resilient tend to do that. Green infrastructure consists of dynamic living systems that can build resilience against climate change and other shocks. And COVID-19 is transforming our societal structures. Right now, we're supposed to spend time outdoors. And again, natural systems are an ideal place for the mental and physical well-being of the individual, but also as a community coming together to work on a project, that you have some kind of an action-oriented agenda. So I'm going to turn this over now to Jay, who's going to be going through some leading case examples that we identified.
Yeah, so thanks for the overview and the background, Paul. It's great to hear from somebody who has a long history in the topic to kind of bring us up to speed on the foundations. But I'm going to dive into a couple of key examples that we gathered from across Canada of rural communities that are kind of leading the way in terms of green infrastructure. The first of which being Gibson's on British Columbia's Sunshine Coast, which is the first municipality to recognize natural assets as an official infrastructure class within their sort of planning and infrastructure management and asset management processes. And basically what this has allowed Gibson's to do is to sort of justify the values that they're getting from some of the natural features within and around the community, and access new funding pathways to invest in enhancing these natural features rather than spending kind of more money on engineered solutions or more traditional gray infrastructure solutions. And their eco-asset strategy, which is where this all kind of developed through, is now recognized as best practice for stormwater management and aquifer protection. And I'm going to keep moving through these relatively quickly, just so we have time for question and answer. But the next example we have is from Cobalt in northeastern Ontario. In the early 2000s, they had a need to upgrade their sewage treatment system, which is an expensive investment for any rural community, any small town. And together with the Ministry of Environment, Cobalt identified that engineered wetlands were a good alternative to a traditional sort of gray storm or wastewater management system, wastewater treatment system. And after constructing the wetlands that you can see in the bottom right corner here, which they were able to do at a lower cost than a traditional approach, they now save up to $300,000 annually on their sewage treatment costs due to reduced construction and maintenance. And they've gained a surprisingly attractive community asset now, which is actually a bit of a draw for recreation and tourism to view the wildlife that the sewage treatment wetlands support. So kind of a surprising benefit that came out of that one, and certainly not what you would imagine being a draw for your town to be people coming to look at how you treat your sewage. But the next example comes from Nova Scotia with some of their living shoreline initiatives. And these are green infrastructure initiatives being led mostly by sort of community environmental organizations, as well as small businesses that are involved in ecosystem restoration. And so living shorelines are a green infrastructure approach to managing coastal erosion, which is a common problem for many Canadian communities, and projected to get worse with climate change. So rather than constructing hard barriers like seawalls, which tend to degrade over time and do a relatively poor job of dissipating wave energy, living shorelines offer a more low-cost and nature-based approach to protect private property and reduce soil erosion during extreme weather events. And then the final example that I want to bring up here is maybe the most relevant in terms of COVID-19 recovery. And it's the idea around active transportation, which we see a great example of in Essex County in Ontario, that has made big investments in sort of the natural assets that they have in terms of abandoned rail corridors and forested trail networks to create these really valuable outdoor spaces for communities to stay active and have sort of a safe, socially distanced social interaction, as well as supporting just kind of that overall community livability and biodiversity that comes along with the preserved green space. So moving on, our Rural Insight paper kind of culminated in 4 big recommendations, the first of which being around prioritizing this idea of shovel-worthy projects rather than shovel-ready projects, which we believe green infrastructure to be fitting well into this, or having a lot of potential for these sorts of shovel-worthy projects that can meet multiple community objectives. So it's not just, say, repaving a road, important as that may be, or planting trees, but making sure that these projects kind of come through to maximize the benefits communities receive from them and hit sort of those multifunctional aspects that Paul highlighted a bit earlier. So you can deliver these projects to get more than one thing done at once. The issue is that that kind of requires some careful planning to make sure that it happens. And a lot of rural communities struggle to have the capacity in terms of funding and human resources to make sure that these projects are thought about in a broader sort of holistic context, and ensuring that they get all those benefits that they have the potential to access. So investing in rural communities to ensure that they have this capacity, whether it's from funding from senior levels of government or setting policy to ensure that there's good standards and knowledge mobilization around the issues of green infrastructure and the potential benefits that it can provide. And this extends into the third point of fostering strategic partnerships as well. As I mentioned, in Nova Scotia, the living shorelines are being delivered largely by community organizations. And so making sure that governments have that kind of room to balance, to work with other community partners, landowners, and the private sector, and make these projects a reality. And my final point is just around the idea of kind of the end of the project and keeping up with monitoring and evaluating to see how well they are working in communities, especially rural communities where it's understudied. These, we need to build a strong body of knowledge to kind of push projects like this forward and stimulate like reliable investment in future communities. Wrong direction. And I just want to close by leaving you with this quote from our Insight paper, in that responding to the COVID-19 pandemic presents an exciting opportunity for communities to evaluate their natural assets and prioritize green infrastructure as a low-tech, low-cost, and community-oriented approach to sustainable service delivery. It is important that we take action now to ensure that communities emerge from this uniquely challenging time without forgoing the short and long-term benefits that come with investing in nature. And at that, I put some references in here for when this gets posted, just for reference, as well as a link to the paper. And I'll turn it back to you, Sean, to move us into some question and answer.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul and Jay. Really interesting presentation. Nice balance of providing the overview with some really interesting case studies to sort of get a real handle on what that actually looks like on the ground. So let's move quickly to questions. I just wanted to pick up one of the themes to start us off that shows up in the chat box around any sort of really innovative examples coming from Indigenous communities in terms of solving some of these infrastructure problems for rural communities.
I can jump in if you like. I put the links in there related to broadband infrastructure, but certainly when it comes to connectivity, we've seen a lot of Indigenous-led and First Nations projects that have been often cases 10 to 20 years ahead of what Canadian jurisdictions, whether that's federal, provincial, municipal, have launched. So one of the ones that's linked there is the First Mile project, and I love that framing because it denotes that the community is the first mile rather than the last mile, which is how we typically talk about it. And so we, even just in the framing there, we see a totally different orientation in terms of the value of this infrastructure. And then another link that I put there is related to the Indigenous Internet Society, who's doing some interesting work and hosting a virtual summit of their own this year, but brings together a lot of a totally different way of thinking about this infrastructure that I think we need to adopt in the Canadian system in terms of thinking about community governance, community ownership, looking at this as a public good, And then again, at framing this, when there's been a great advocacy done by folks like Bianca Wiley and others who are talking about, we can look at infrastructure as a way to reconsider our structural relationships between Canadian settlers and First Nations and Indigenous people in terms of how we honor our treaty agreements and build out these pieces of infrastructure in a collaborative way. So I think those are all often missing from the discussion and really, really important in terms of certainly from the connectivity side and the threads that I'm hearing in our other presenters as well.
Sean, I have one example for the First Nations in terms of green infrastructure provision, and it was a tree planting initiative, more or less, to simplify it, but it was the Munsee Delaware First Nation in Southern Ontario, where they received the carbon offset funding from a major bank in Canada that was interested in the corporate sustainability initiative. And what the First Nation did with the funding was plant the trees, fast-growing poplar trees that could carbon capture. They used money, again, from the bank then to hire youth to educate them about silviculture and all the attributes that trees can give you, and also cultivate, ensure to keep the weeds down to let the trees grow. So it was a win-win-win proposition. It wasn't defined as a green infrastructural project, but in effect, it did meet all the objectives of quite a sustainable and resilient way of, let's do it simple, plant trees, and it meets a lot of different objectives.
Yeah, in my organization, Deatra has a community infrastructure fund, so communities can access upwards of $100,000 towards infrastructure projects, some of which have gone towards water infrastructure projects, particularly in cases where municipalities or local service districts do not have the revenue to cover their percentage on a provincial or federal project. And so this project allows for those types of projects to happen by NCC absorbing the costs of the community percentage through that funding pot.
Great, thank you very much. Really interesting examples. Going back up the chat function there, question for Deatra and Amy from Sarah Breen around how to deal with particularly small water systems, particularly where communities might not want treatment.
Yeah, so I can start with that, and that's a great question. So thanks, Sarah. Recently, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador put out an early call for applications for communities to address their long-term boil water advisories. So again, these are communities with advisories that have been in place in excess of 2 years. And they had 3 types of boil water advisories, and under the long-term categorization, they categorize it by infrastructure deficiency. So there are a number of elements there that are thought of as being deficient. But then the second long-term one is categorized as a lack of willingness. And these are the biggest challenge for local service districts. This is what's written on the government circular. These fall into 2 categories. There's no infrastructure for disinfection. The community has no desire to apply for infrastructure funding. And 2, infrastructure is there, but the community is not operating it either due to operational costs or the common perception that chlorine is problematic. So I think, there's a discourse I wrote in my comment to Sarah on resistance. And I think what we have to dig into a little bit more there is why. We just can't sort of say there's a lack of willingness or people don't like the taste of chlorine. Like, you can't stop there as a conversation. Part of what we've been talking about inside of our collaborative research group is, and part of our work at MNL, part of our collaborative work with other people is, what are communities facing in terms of the realities of their own situation? What is the infrastructure that makes sense for them? And the engineered solutions that are being presented to them, maybe they're not the right ones. And maybe they've been the wrong ones for a really long time. We have communities who simply cannot, in terms of whatever the level of service just won't work for these larger and archaic pieces of infrastructure. So we need to really think broadly and innovatively going forward in terms of what that means, and then turn that lack of willingness around. I think it's a problematic discourse anyway. Amy, anything to add to that on the piece of willingness?
Yeah, I mean, I think you reflected it very well, and I too see an issue with the discourse around unwillingness. I mean, I don't know many unwilling people who are opposed to safe, clean drinking water, I suppose. But certainly there is a need to, you know, really get to know communities and better understand, as you mentioned, Deatra, the nature of water access in their community, and how we can adapt systems that are in place or to make life better and to ensure that people have a trustworthy source. I mean, I know in Black Tickle, it's not an unwillingness to have access to clean drinking water. I'm from the community, actually. It's a matter of, you know, when a system consistently breaks down, or there's service interruptions, or there's a lack of funding to maintain the system, then people lose some confidence in a system like that, particularly one that is a little foreign. It was only brought into the community in the early 2000s, and prior to that, they were, you know, quite accustomed, and still are, to traditional sources of water from brooks and springs. So there's a lot to think about, a lot to consider. It's not like just writing off these systems or under, you know, a lot going on.
Great, thank you very much. Got another comment for Jay and Paul from Ian Cowie. I think he asked a question that is raised quite often around green infrastructure, speaking specifically about performance. Any comments on that in terms of performance confidence?
I would say that is one of the sort of biggest barriers in a lot of ways, especially when you're using green infrastructure for something like stormwater management, where there are performance standards and expectations for what it has the capacity to manage. So that's partly where the need for more post-construction monitoring comes in, to demonstrate that these systems can be effective. In terms of the rural context, I think that's even more pressing, and it's especially challenging to measure some of the sort of multifunctional benefits of these projects when maybe they're not so obvious to see kind of the outcomes, or necessarily measure them in terms of like flows of water or some of those sorts of things when you're talking about sort of the soft community benefits that you get out of enhancing the natural asset. So I'll leave it open to you, Paul, if you have more thoughts about that.
Yeah, so that's natural capital valuation. So as our economic system states, if you don't value something, put a value, a monetary number on it, then it's worthless. So the best example in the Ontario context here is the Greenbelt Foundation around the Toronto region. They're fighting to maintain that their existence, and that so they've done a lot of work in terms of monetizing all the value that is derived from the natural areas, the agricultural areas, the open space that's in proximity to the Toronto centered region. So I would encourage you to go look at that. Gibson's, again, municipal natural assets valuation, management, natural asset. You have to, again, put a value on that. When the financiers want to know, well, what are we giving up, or what are we benefiting from putting in a natural system to clean our water, or to treat our stormwater, or to treat our wastewater? And so that is interesting initiatives through, again, the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative that's kind of spreading across the country.
Great, thanks very much. And just mindful of the time here, I wanted to ask one more question of Ashleigh and Wayne. It's from Peter Smith, and I think it speaks to the infrastructure question writ large, but a question specifically asked of broadband. But do you see anything either in terms of the innovative responses, or perhaps the sort of renewed attention around broadband that might break this frustrating cycle of generational delay that you mentioned in your presentation and was clearly echoed in the chat functions as well.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that there are lots of rural communities, or increasingly lots of rural communities, that are getting this right. Whether it's regional approaches like SWIFT in Southwestern Ontario or in Eastern Ontario, EORN. And out here in Manitoba, we don't have such big population or community groupings, but we have 3 or 4 instances now of individual communities deciding to just get this solution done. And they've committed to it at a municipal level. Their residents have bought in. And so whether it's the town of Hamiota that has synchronous fiber to the home in the community and very good quality fixed Wi-Fi to the surrounding municipality. There's also examples in Manitoba of small businesses that have taken upon themselves to deliver and are growing based on those successes. So it's not always going to be a community solution. There are market solutions, but when they're developed locally and supported locally, they have a lot better chance of reflecting, especially in rural communities, sort of the needs and opportunities there. So there are some a growing number of examples of how communities are sort of solving this on their own, and that's one of the things that Ashleigh and I sort of call for, is greater support of those specific solutions and alternative solutions. Ashleigh, if you want to speak to anything else on that.
Real quick, ditto. I know we've got 2 minutes left, so I won't be the reason we're late, but I think that we really truly need to go back to first principles of how we do policy development and governance. So one of the challenges is that there is no standard or interoperable data standard in terms of not only where the infrastructure is, but how it's being adopted. We're just very data poor in Canada around our infrastructure information. Most asset management only considers things like roads and traditional infrastructure. So this applies to not just broadband, but to green infrastructure, water management, social housing, any of these kinds of things, that we really need to get a better handle on what these assets are and provide better research evidence to decision makers. So part of the funding that comes from infrastructure capacity building has to go to evaluation and data collection, and really looking at the way we govern and manage that data as part of our decision-making process. So the first place to start is to really require that any of these private providers make that information public, and that is a public good. Because if we're going to put public money into it, it should be owned and stewarded by communities. So I think that it's really less about fancy, innovative kind of solutions in terms of a buzzword, but more about getting back to doing things in the service of people to better enable our communities to manage these assets rather than to throw good money after bad.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great place to end. On behalf of all the participants, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their wonderful presentations. I encourage everyone to go to the link, the SURF COVID-19 link, and download the insight papers associated with these presentations. They are also excellent. And I'm sure, speak on behalf of all of the presenters, that they would be more than happy to engage with you if you have follow-up questions after the session. I'd also like just to acknowledge that we didn't have to suffer the irony of having connectivity issues on the infrastructure panel. So that was kind of a nice bonus to get us through the rest of this morning. It's now afternoon in the West Coast. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for the participation and questions, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.